Regrettably, I'm about to cause trouble. Written and narrated by Amie McNee. Chapter 23. Well, God's spotted toad. That hadn't been very hard, had it? We were passing through yet another gate into the King's gallery. The next step would be the King's privy chambers themselves. I felt my insatiable lust for ascension rear its head. I bet, given the right circumstances, I could get in there. My hands tingled from the touch of His Majesty's face. I was riding incredibly high. I kept looking at the witches, wanting to talk to them, to giggle with them. I mean, what in God's balls had just happened? But they wouldn't make eye contact with me. Had they known about Rufus and the King's relationship this whole time? It was unfathomable to me that Rufus, the man who had been sleeping mere steps away from me the last few months, made free with the first name of the King of bollocking England. We entered the gallery. It was a long, dark room. Wooden panelling sat up against the deepest red walls, and hanging on the walls themselves were nearly 100 different painted faces, the kings of England, all staring at me, most of them dead, and consequentially most of them all-knowing, witnessing this witch, Maude, wade into the king's halls. I liked all the faces, and the jewels that adorned their painted necklines, and I even liked their all-knowing leers, but my favourite part of the gallery was the roof. It had been decked out in Yuletide cheer. Perhaps 50 kissing bows had been hung from the beams, big bunches of mistletoe and other evergreen leaves bunched together in these celebratory orbs hanging from the Hampton Court sky. It was raining forest. Zita and Hildy had obviously made it this far before. "We'll go into that corner over there. Ah, yes, do you see Mrs. Goodthatcher is waving at us?" A tiny woman, who would only rise to my hips, was waving at us. She was adorned in pearls and rubies like a tiny queen. "Hello, Lady Goodthatcher." "Good morrow, Zita." "Hello, Hildy," she said, waving us over. "I saved you a table in the good corner." "You are too kind. This is Maude. She's part of the coven now." "Merry Christmas, Maude. I'm the court dwarf. You can call me Goodthatcher." "Well met, Goodthatcher." "You'll need a table to set out your trinkets?" "I probably just need a stool for myself and a stool for my patron," I guessed. "Nay, don't listen to our apprentice," interrupted Zita. "Get her a table, Goodthatcher. I might get her a crystal ball." "Leave it with me." Goodthatcher was off. I was about to protest, having never used a crystal ball in my life, but more pressing issues were afoot. I hit Zita playfully in the shoulder. "Maude," she protested. "Have you always known Rufus is as good as His Majesty's kin?" Hildy looked up at me. She was setting up her wares on the table. "We did. Why didn't you tell me? I've been bossing him around the past 6 months, making him sweep the floors." Zita threw me a dirty look. "Tell me, what is his story?" "You should ask him, Maude." "Tell me," I said, getting annoyed. "He's old friends with the king. They grew up at Greenwich together, as young boys." My mind reeled. "How?" "He came over from Spain with the Princess Dowager." Comprehension dawned. "He was the first queen's slave?" I asked. Zita nodded. "Rufus's dear mother hardly left Aragon's side. She was her favourite. She's still with her now, I believe, in exile." I opened my mouth, about to unleash. "No more questions about Rufus, Maude. You can ask him yourself." "As you say, Aunt Zita," I said, making sure my words were dripping in sarcasm. "What happens to us now?" I demanded. "Most of the courtiers will go into the great hall for the feast." "I thought court was fasting." "Oh, Maude, how much you have to learn about court," Zita tittered. Why did she goad me so? "They fast in that they abstain from the heavier meats and might have fewer courses of sweet things. After eating, the music will start to play and the games will begin, and everyone will mingle and get drunk, and we will read the stars, hand out medicine to invigorate the male sexual organ, and you will remedy every courtier's broken heart." There was a kerfuffle at the door. The flatterers were here. There was Rufus. Somewhere in the middle must have been the king. I still had not seen any of my kin, nor my husband. There was a laugh about the mistletoe, and a hurrah of escalating noise until someone kissed another. Cheers of delight. I might have laughed too, but I was watching Rufus. He had a trumpet in his hand. He held it limply by his side and was laughing with a smart-looking courtier. He was relaxed and totally at ease. I felt like I was watching another man. He looked over at our corner and he smiled at me. I gave him a small wave. He grinned. Will we not see Rufus any more? Zita put her crystal ball down slap bang in the middle of the newly set table. You'll see a lot of him tomorrow. The musicians eat and drink with us on Christmas evening. Can you do tarot, Maude? I turned to look at Zita, incredulous. Have you taught me tarot, Zita? I asked indignantly. Nay. Then nay, I cannot do tarot. Very well, you be on the crystal ball. You haven't taught me that either. She sat me down behind the large, sparkling ball. Use your powers to read people and interpret from that as you wish. Verily, I think we are a big band of scamming vagabonds, I muttered, looking into the piece of glass. Firelight flickered in its depths. The three of us sat in a row. It felt absurd. The hall was still very empty. I turned to my aunts. Are we the only people to sit in the King's Gallery? No point being where the king is not, said a stranger's voice. Jane, said both the witches at once. She had appeared seemingly out of nowhere. I suppose she must have entered through a secret door, one of those that sink into the panelling and that are used by the king to fornicate with people discreetly. How are you, wise women? Her voice was slightly distorted, as if she was eating something at the same time as speaking. She also signed for Hildy. I hadn't seen anyone sign for her, other than the three of us at home. We are very well, Jane. Maude has managed to get us into the King's Gallery with a promptness we haven't managed before. My body actually shivered with pride. Maude, Jane repeated, and then came down to give me a big hug. She held me so tightly I felt emotional. Good God, had I been that deprived of touch that a firm hug made me spring a leak? Zita began telling the story of my impression upon His Majesty, and I watched Jane's face as she listened intently. Jane the Fool's face was different. It was possibly the sweetest face I had ever seen. She was an angel, perhaps. It was also obvious that, like William, half her mind was in the heavens. That was why the Queen liked to have her by her side, said Zita, because she was connected to God, a vessel for divine wisdom. You are connected to a higher power, Maude, she said to me, beaming. I bowed my head. She certainly is. I jumped. It was William Summers. Good God, how many goddamn secret doors were there in this gallery? Hello, William, said Jane. The two of them embraced. Good Thatcher reappeared with two servants in tow. Hildy got up to greet them, and then so did Zita, while I sat, crystal ball in hand, watching this strange reunion of all the oddballs at court. I enjoyed it. Good Thatcher winked at me. I smiled. I liked this crowd. I wished Rufus were here. I heard the doors of the gallery being heaved open, and a whisk of cold air rushed in. Prepare, everyone, declared Good Thatcher. I sat up straight and took a deep breath. The sound of the courtiers flooded through before the people did themselves. The cold air absorbed by the laughing and the talking and the music. Then came the bodies, and they filled the gallery in a matter of minutes. Are you the witch that read the king? Asked a man. Yes, my lord. He sat down in front of me and looked at me expectantly. Was I going to look into the crystal ball? Should I? I really should have had crystal ball training. This was absurd. What is on your mind, my lord? I asked. He sighed, annoyed that I couldn't tell him that for him. What's on all our minds? He said pointedly. Fuck. I tried to throw a sideways glance to Zita, who was reading tarot for a woman with the largest breasts I've ever seen. It was distracting. She looked at me briefly, but was obviously not able to surreptitiously feed me the answer. The king and queen? I guessed. He rolled his eyes. Is she actually with child? He asked under his breath. I cannot see any sort of shape under her dresses. He rejigged his codpiece, and my skin crawled. I am not with Her Majesty, my lord. I cannot read the state of her womb through your eyes. He scoffed, annoyed. Was everyone at court this unpleasant? Well, is she a witch? Is she one of your kind? I faltered. I'm afraid I can only tell you whether you are a witch or not a witch, as it is you who sits before me. And? He asked without any humour. Not a witch, I said, hoping Zita was catching some of this amusing but stupid conversation. That's something. He took a swig out of a flask and crossed his legs, seeming to be settled into this spot. He gazed absently over the ever-swelling sea of courtiers. Whilst he was distracted, I also scanned the room. Mother had a red dress I know she loved to wear at court, so I began scanning all the ladies in red. Who's a tall black man near the king? He asked suddenly. A question I could answer. He's the king's trumpeter. He's been away for some time. I don't like the look of him, he said gruffly. All these Moors and foreigners swarming in our halls. It's pollution. I opened my mouth to correct the judgmental cunt, but Zita's hand had flown out and was sitting firmly on my knee. I swallowed and composed myself. Any other questions for my beneficent magic? I asked pointedly. Ugh. He looked around as though searching for something, anything a witch could do for him. I suppose I could do with a charm. I feel called to give you a charm. Verily, because I just asked you for one. I feel called to give you a charm to heighten your sense of deception. He leaned forwards, interested by this. Yes. I bit my lip and reached into my pockets, revealing to him a dried-out acorn. He tried to take it. Wait! I must charm it first. I began whispering to the acorn. I whispered bad intentions, suggesting that the seed might tempt the courtier to make a fool of himself, preferably publicly. I handed it to him. It's ready. Carry this with you. Trust your instincts. What does thou mean? You'll see, I whispered seductively. He got up slowly and wandered off into the crowd in a daze, armed with an acorn. I turned immediately to Zita, ready to let rip. She was already holding up a long, pointed finger. There will be many like him, Maude. Acquaint yourself with their ways. And there were many. I spoke to over a dozen men and women courtiers, more than half of them disappointed I couldn't reveal the secrets of other people. I had spotted my elder brother's wife, who had looked directly at me but seemed not to notice who I was. Her eyes just passed over me and on to the next person. I wondered if my mother's new babe had kept her at home. The possibility disappointed me. A bell was rung, and everyone began wandering into the great hall. Do we follow them in? Not unless we are called to entertain them during the feast, which we rarely are. We eat out here. I nodded. The courtiers drifted away. Music was playing. I tried to listen out for the trumpet. I wanted to hear him play. The final courtier was swept up into the great hall. After a courtesy minute, to give time for stragglers, the yeoman closed the doors. The doors creaked shut, and it sounded as though the gallery was exhaling with relief. God blimey, said Hildy, reclining and putting her feet up onto Zita's lap. There's an outbreak of a rash in court, and before Christmas at that. None of this lot can keep it in their codpieces. I watched as Zita carefully removed Hildy's slippers and began rubbing her feet, as she did in their own not-so-great hall. I looked around. What if the goddamn King of England saw? Jane the Fool was approaching with drinks, several fellows in tow. There was a scuffling of tables drawn over the ground, and then both the fools, Good Thatcher, a woman with darker skin than Rufus, and a man with a stick who appeared to be blind, all sat down around us. I was introduced to them all at once. You been treating the rash going around, Hildy? Asked the blind man. Zita translated his question to her. Aye, it's rife. I'll need access to the kitchen gardens tomorrow to make more salve. Is court more than usually randy? The king is lascivious at the moment for certs, said William, who was already onto his third cup of ale. How do you mean? I asked. He's hungry for purse, said Jane, her sweet, sweet face smiling kindly. What a thing to say out of that lovely mouth. And when he wants to have lots of lovely affairs, he prefers it if his whole court does the same. Takes the edge off the guilt, said someone whose name I hadn't caught. He feels no guilt, Summer said very loudly. Her Majesty is as much of a ribald as he is. He just loves his court so much that he feels he cannot have all the pleasures for himself. He likes to watch others partake in the fruit he is enjoying. I looked around. My heart was still beating fast, and I could only begin to imagine the punishments we would receive if this slandering was discovered. Do not worry, dear Maude. This is our time to drink and our time to say as we please, said Good Thatcher. I smiled at her, still uncertain. As their fast-day feasting went on, and it did go on, for a very long time, we became drunker and merrier, and I finally loosened up. This little squadron of misfits was the most quick-witted bunch I had ever come across. My sides were aching with laughter. It was dark humour, often about their ailments or their unseemliness, terribly self-deprecating, terribly funny. The conversation whirled around and around, bouncing between Jane saying very inappropriate and obvious things, William mocking everyone around him, Good Thatcher cracking jokes about her size, and even Zita making merry about committing malfeasance and kissing women. And then it finally landed on me, Maude. So, Maude, what is your affliction? Asked the blind man, who I still only knew as blind man, but whom I liked very much. I'm a witch, I said simply, wishing I had something more amusing to say. No one is simply born a witch, said Good Thatcher gently. How did you become such? I looked to Hildy and Zita, who were watching me kindly, holding each other's hands. I was born a witch. I have a very large witch's mark up most of the front of my body, I said, spurred on by the wine. Oh yes, like the Spanish fool with the mark on her face, said Jane. I had never imagined a mark on one's face. The great hall doors opened, and a few of the musicians exited. Rufus was trailing behind. I sat up. When are you two going to become lovers? Asked a voice from behind me. I felt like my whole body had been dunked in cold water. I turned behind me to see a very drunk Hildy being scolded by Zita, her tiny little hands covering her mouth, stifling her giggles. What? I snapped. Friends, Rufus said, sitting next to us. Everyone greeted him. Everyone knew him well, of course. Have the witches made you angry? He asked, noticing my frown. They're being strange. Stop being strange, witches. He was in a good mood. Was it good to pick up the trumpet again? I asked. He sighed. His body relaxed. Yes. It was like being reunited with a very long-lost friend. I can't wait to hear you play. Hildy snickered. You're meant to be fucking deaf, Hildy. How in God's name can you snicker at me when you're supposed to not be able to hear what I am saying? Hildy only giggled louder. Zita translates, she squealed. I stared daggers at Zita. Your ruff looks ridiculous, I said spitefully. They're really getting on your nerves tonight, aren't they? He was sitting close to me, his side rubbing up against mine. I looked up to him. They're relentless, Rufus. The king took a shine to you. You were bold to touch His Majesty's face like that. I know. I could hardly stop thinking about the moment. A guard approached. His Majesty is ready for a ghost story. He wants a witch. I looked around. Hildy hiccuped and fell off her chair and onto the floor. Zita gasped and tended to her. Who's going to go? I asked hurriedly. I'll go, said Zita, pulling Hildy onto the chair. My mistake, said the guard. He wanted the witch. The one from before, he said, shrugging. Oh, fuck no. The profanity slipped out of my mouth. I couldn't help it. Rufus put his hand in the small of my back. You'll be all right, Maude, he whispered. I'll come back in with you. What do I do? I asked, as we walked hand in hand to the door. Go wild. They love performance. Go full witch. But what ghost story do I tell? I would start with your favourite. The tables were configured like a horseshoe, and I stood in the middle of the hoof, looking up to the King and Queen of England. Directly above me was a halo of candles suspended on an iron rig attached to the roof. The light flickered around me, making holly-shaped shadows as it hit the reefs on the tables. I had decided not to scan the room upon entry. My kin would be at these tables. I didn't need to know exactly where as I bumbled through this performance. I was about to tell the only ghost story I knew, the one about the man with the load of beans. It was very noisy. I hoped someone might hush the room. Did they want a ghost story or not? I tried not to shuffle my feet. Rufus stood behind the king's table. He held my gaze and signed to me. It's fine. I promised myself to only look at the high table. I didn't have the strength to see my mother staring at me right now. But my eyes slipped, and I looked down the row of the head table. That was Charles fucking Brandon. He was as good-looking as they said. Did Charles want a ghost story? I stared at him, willing him to notice me, but it wasn't happening. He was in deep conversation with the woman next to him. I tried several other courtiers, boring my eyes into them, trying to draw anyone's attention to my willingness to tell ghost stories. Or ghost story, singular. Nothing. The king wasn't even in his chair. He was halfway down the table, talking to a very pretty woman adorned in royal jewels. There was no getting him to notice me. My eyes went to Anne. As soon as my eyes rested upon her, she felt me and looked up. Our gazes met. She smiled a big, genuine smile. It was so lovely, I think my heart stopped. After several moments of stunned immobility, I returned her kindness and smiled back. She made a shushing gesture with her hands. Nothing happened. Her bright eyes flashed with something. A realization, I thought. She stood up, looking around the room, demanding silence with her eyes. But no one noticed the Queen. The court were not interested in her movements. This was not a realization. This was a confirmation. I could see it in the way her shoulders came forwards a little, the way her jaw tightened. She was not what she had been. Something ran past me, making me jump. It was the fool, Summers, to the rescue. "Henry, stop flirting with everyone else's wives," he bellowed. My body went cold. The sound was wrenched out of the room as if I had gone deaf. I watched the back of Summers, standing tall, staring at the king. His Majesty hadn't immediately turned to his fool. He was still staring at the woman he was wooing. He cupped the lady's chin affectionately, and then, very slowly, he turned his head. "Summers!" he bellowed, his fury rattling through the hanging insignia and making the flags blow like his breath was a strong northerly breeze. Then his face broke into a big grin. "Are you saying it is time for some festive ghost stories?" The great hall broke into cheers. William turned to me. "They're yours now. Make sure you entertain them." "Why can't you do this?" I asked, in one last attempt to excuse myself. He frowned at me. "I cannot tell a lie." He left. The king took his seat, and everyone hushed. "What story will you tell us?" Henry demanded. "You will see, Your Majesty," I smiled. He made a gesture with his goblet that I assumed meant I could go on. "All right, here we go." I shook my hair. "Loosen up, Maude. Say something." I looked to Rufus, who was nodding, encouraging. Then I turned to the crowd. My mother and father. He wasn't looking at me, but was rather determinedly glaring at his own crotch. My mother, on the other hand, was looking right at me, her lip quivering. Our eyes fixed onto one another for the 1 second I had before I needed to start my story. She was rubbing her belly. It was empty, of course, but still she rubbed it as she always did when she was anxious. I knew her dark and dirty secrets now. I wonder if she felt guilt over the abortion of her first babe to this day. I gave her a big smile, and she blanched. I raised my hands high in the air and threw my head back. "I summon the spirits," I bellowed. Someone gave a little yelp. My father had been startled and was looking at me now. I beamed at him. The colour was drained from his face too. I turned to face the King and Queen of England. "I summon the spirits to people this story of the ghostly world." I paused, as though listening to something no one else could hear. I paced around the horseshoe. "Ah," I whispered loudly. "The veil between us and the other side is thin tonight." A timely chill whisked into the great hall. I saw someone shiver. "Tonight, the ghoulies are calling for the story of—" I turned around to the circle, holding my arms up, grasping the air for my tail. "The farmer, the horse, and his beans!" The crowd erupted with cheers. The story was a simple one. It was about a farmer on his way with a load of beans. I painted the picture well enough, set the scene. I put it in London so that the court would feel close to the tale told. But of course, something ungodly happens on the road, and the horse meets with an accident. I made it gruesome, for the fun of it. After the horse is spooked by a strange noise in the King's Wood, a broken tree branch lances the beast in his proud chest. The distraught farmer cannot save him. I assured the crowd that blood was everywhere. I could feel the energy of the room. I had them. The story had them. And I hadn't even got to the scary part. I went on, describing the sad farmer stumbling further down the road with his beans on his back. But then he stops in his tracks. "What's that?" I asked the court. It was an apparition of his horse. Ghost horse. Terrifying, semi-translucent ghost horse. He tries to shoo the ghost horse away, chasing it down with a wooden spoon, but the apparition persists. I looked the king in the eye. I registered the fact that he was enjoying it. He was watching me intently. "Of course he has not yet tried to dispel it in the name of the Lord," cried out Henry, interrupting. "Exactly, Your Majesty," I exclaimed. "This would never happen to the King of England." But of course, eventually, after much ghostly harassment, the bean farmer remembers he must dispel the ghost in the name of the Lord. And so he does. The horse turns into a ball of bright light and is replaced by another ghostly apparition. A man. I changed my voice to imitate the new human ghost. "Do not be afraid, bean farmer. I do not mean you any harm. I only wondered if I could carry your beans for you." The court roared with laughter. It wasn't particularly funny, in my opinion, but I took the joy. relishing the performance and waiting for silence before finishing the tale. The apparition carries the beans across the river, the two talk for a bit, and before you know it, the farmer is at his destination and the beans reappear on his back. I thanked the spirits for their stories. I allowed myself more dramatic arm-waving, then I bowed and there was applause. I looked at my feet. Jesus, maybe I was made for performance. Maybe I wasn't a witch, but some sort of professional ghost storyteller. Maybe they would want me here full-time. I let out a laugh. I think I liked court. Applause and performance and thrills. God bless you, witch, said the Queen, her voice ringing out over the applause. I looked up at her and inclined my head. She was so very beautiful. But then she looked away, and in a single moment, a beat, a single inhalation of breath, all the magic I had conjured was gone, sucked out of the room. The king began talking to a tall man with a longer-than-fashionable beard. The courtiers to my left and right were up and moving into the space where I stood. My parents had gone. The music began to play again. I was being sucked up into the movement around me. Forgotten. You need to come with me, said the guard. He took hold of my arm and pulled me from the great hall. I can escort myself. I tried to wiggle free, but he didn't seem to care. No one was looking at me. All my amusement was over, and no one cared where the witch was taken. The guard escorted me back to Zita and Hildy as though returning a lost child. I was seething by the time he finally released me. I shook him off violently, then stared at the motley crew. Is it always like that? I demanded. You're not a courtier, Maude, said Summers. You're a witch. I know, I said defensively, but I just sold them a fucking excellent story, which they all loved, and yet I'm dragged off like a bloody heretic. Jane came over and began rubbing my back. She was making hushing noises, and surprisingly the sound settled me. I took a ragged breath. You're going to need to shake off that bad mood, Maude, because you're back on duty in a minute or two. She was right. The great hall doors were opening. I saw my parents, I grumbled, sitting down. Did they say anything? Zita asked, concerned. Nay. Then there is nothing to worry about. I wasn't really worried per se, more, you don't need them anymore, Maude, so put them out of your mind. She had spoken so forcefully, I didn't know how to reply.